Alright, I think we've just about got our tub ready. We've got hot water, bubbles, Epsom salt, some essential oils, lavender, always, a rubber duck, whom I've named Winston. All I'm missing is my co-host, the incomparable Lady Gleep, to complete the picture. Surely she'll be here any moment. Well, while we wait, I guess I'll tell you about Winston. He's named after Winston Churchill, who am I kidding? I'm gonna call Gleep. I'm a little bit out of my depths here. Hold on. Where the fuck are you? No, I don't know how to talk to these people. What do you mean? Chloe, I can't do this by myself. Burk, bark, bjork, everybody. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Liberal Bubble. It's just me this week, Skydoge. And if you don't like that, that hurts my feelings. But we'll get through it together, because we're all each other has in this very lonely tub. But I do have space to spread out, which is kind of nice. I mean, I can spread my legs. I got space for my tail because I am an anthropomorphic dog man. Things could be worse, though I do miss my wonderful co-host who could not be here with us today. To explain why Lady Gleep is not able to be here today, I will pull back the shower curtain and tell you a little bit about behind the scenes. We typically record on Thursdays to release our episodes on Tuesday. But this most recent Thursday, I was out of commission due to COVID-19 vaccine side effects, which are wonderful in comparison to the virus itself. I cannot recommend the vaccine highly enough. Get it wherever you can, whichever you can, as soon as you can, people. Get stuck in the arm. But we rescheduled to Sunday. And when I reached out to Lady Gleep today and asked her what time she wanted to record, she responded, "Oh, today is Sunday?" To which I responded, "Yes, it is." Lady Gleep sends her deepest regrets for not being able to join us for our weekly scrub-a-dub-dub. I was going to say 3 men in a tub, but gender is so passé. And there is 3 of us if you include Winston the rubber duck, which I do. Certainly keeping me afloat today. But Glo could not be here because her phone broke and she has to go to Yonkers. I did not ask any questions about that, though as I am relaying this information to you, I'm realizing I have quite a few. Why Yonkers? Where's Yonkers? Who's Yonkers? How's Yonkers? Perhaps she'll be able to answer some of those questions for us next week. But this week, it's just you and me, so get comfy. Because today, we are going to talk about what it is like to feel burnt out around politics, and how to take a break, and how to reintegrate yourself into the never-ending shitstorm that is American politics. Truly, truly inspiring stuff. So, on today's episode, I'll talk about my most recent step back from politics, what that looks like, what it entails, what I benefit from by reintegrating into politics, and how I go about doing that after a hiatus of sorts. But first, I would like to start by slandering the good name of my co-host, who is absent and unable to defend herself. Lady Gleep, one of my dearest co-workers. You've abandoned me. I thought I could trust you. And you told me you was getting cigarettes and you was gonna come right back. And you didn't. We'll be right back. This episode of The Liberal Bubble is brought to you by privatized health insurance, providing individuals the illusory promise of freedom of choice when choosing insurance and doctors while simultaneously restricting individuals' access to health care. As an individual consumer, I've had the freedom to pick any plan I'd like from a very small list of options composed exclusively of closed networks. It's truly liberating. Need to see a specialist? Choose freely from the limited options and hope to God you find a high-quality doctor within your network. Not able to find the clinician you need in your area? That sounds difficult. Hopefully you'll find comfort in the fact that you're being denied access to affordable healthcare by the plan that you chose. Freedom of choice truly is the best medicine. I've used private health insurance before. I wouldn't be promoting something I didn't believe in. Come on, guys. And I, for one, have experienced the rapturous joy of suddenly being told that a medication I've taken for years is suddenly no longer covered by my insurance. No justification needed. Freedom to choose your doctors isn't free. Between premiums, co-pays, deductibles, denied claims, and out-of-network doctors, it's actually exorbitantly expensive. But the illusion of free choice? Now that's priceless. Privatized health insurance, providing you the unfettered freedom to choose between restricted networks of doctors. What are you waiting for? There's nothing stopping you from potentially getting good access to quality health care. Good luck, and may the odds be ever in your favor. Back to the show. And we're back. And I'm not crying at all. You're crying, and I think it's a little weird how emotional you got today. So maybe it's allergies. I don't know.
Child. Anyway, so
We're just gonna move on and try to compensate for the absence of Lady Gleep, who cannot be replaced, and who I miss dearly. Come back to me soon. When will my husband return from war? But on today's subject, I want to start by describing my personal relationship to politics. How it started, how it deepened, how it serves me. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the falling outs I've had and methods of reintegration. I believe I've mentioned it on the pod before, but I got into politics after the election of Donald Trump because I was really fucking confused. And I realized I had a lot of questions about the way we elected a president and why and how what had happened had come to pass. And so I started looking into it. I read every book that I could about the 2016 election. This included insider accounts of the Clinton campaign, Hillary Clinton's book, What Happened, a book about Steve Bannon, a book about what it was like to be on the presidential campaign trail in a sort of Hunter S. Thompson gonzo journalism style, a book called Insane Clown President. So as you can see, I did approach with a little bit of a bias. I was not a Trump fan. I am to this day not. But I wanted to figure out how he had ascended to the highest office in the land, and who helped him do it, and why people had voted for this person who I found reprehensible. And that's my opinion, but that's how I felt. And as a result, a lot of the sources I was reading were not written from the conservative perspective, but nor do I think that they were complete liberal propaganda, some of them more than others. I mean, Hillary Clinton's book is pretty one-sided from the perspective of Hillary Clinton. So there was absolutely a certain level of liberal, bias that played into the way I began educating myself. This also included discovering podcasts that were extremely political in nature. I think I began with Crooked Media's Pod Save America, which is about as openly liberal a news source as you can find. The organization raises money to help elect Democrats, though they are not themselves affiliated with the Democratic Party. It's run by former speechwriters and high-level staffers from the Obama administration. It's a fine news podcast to keep up with current events, as long as you understand that you're getting a democratic partisan point of view on the events. They are not unbiased, nor do I believe that they claim to be. Something more unbiased, I will say it till my dying day, would be the PBS NewsHour, available to stream on YouTube or via your podcast app, totally free, available to everyone. Very balanced, calm recounting of the day's events, global, not just national. It's not like 24-hour cable where it's one story done to death with panel after panel of unrecognizable pundits whose qualifications are very much in question. I don't know why most of the people on cable news are qualified to be there, even though they tell me in the little chyron. But if you haven't, I cannot recommend enough just checking out the PBS NewsHour for it's a whole different news experience. It doesn't feel like the world's on fire, even when it does, because it's just trying to give you the facts. I have been told that PBS has a liberal bias by conservatives who I know and love, to which I say I don't know what to tell you. Perhaps facts have a liberal bias, but I am not the keeper of truth. I was fired from that job many moons ago. But I began, believe it or not, in all honesty, I began at CNN, just watching cable news on a loop, particularly in the early days of the Trump presidency, because I was shooketh and I had a lot of free time on my hands. So, cable news, it does have a function, and it's a perfectly fine place to start as long as you understand it's not the best way, in my opinion, to consume news generally, but at the beginning it's an accessible way to identify key players and keeping up with the current events. But I think it lacks substance. I think it doesn't have the va-va-voom of a Judy Woodruff on the PBS NewsHour. But nevertheless, it was a way to begin to feel connected to the updates ongoing. And what I began to realize day after day as I tuned into the news is that all that the news is a narrativization of life itself, of history, writing history as it happens, or at least attempting in theory. And over time, I developed what I would call a media diet. I began with Don Lemon at 10 p.m. and Pod Save America, and then I progressed to Rachel Maddow because I really enjoy news from a sarcastic lesbian who's taking the scenic route, because she usually has something insightful to say, unless it's showing us one page of Donald Trump's tax returns. But otherwise, I generally enjoyed her. I tuned into her program every night for a while. She was helpful in following complicated, developing stories, particularly the first impeachment of Donald Trump. She had the receipts and documents, and now no punditry panels for the first half of the program, so I felt like I could actually get something by way of content. And once that media diet developed, it was suddenly easy for me to keep up with the story. I could just tune into any one of my chosen sources and get an update and have a pretty good idea of what's going on. Perfect? Not at all. I'm far from perfect, but functional. And then my curiosity deepened, progressing beyond the scope of politics and into the realm of policy, which, as a young in college, I didn't know anything about. But I was lucky enough to be in college, and so I took classes that I could learn about policy in, and it became a focus of my studies. And with that came the incorporation of new things in my media diet, like content from Vox, and that is Vox with a V for victory, not Fox, which begins with an F for flawed, to put it charitably. And something like Vox is also left-leaning, but is explanatory in nature and isn't in any way affiliated with the Democratic Party in the way that something like Pod Save America is. And suddenly I was learning about things that I had no conception of. I'm talking healthcare. I'm talking monetary policy. I'm talking the complexities of foreign policy and a rational state model. And I would listen to conversations on programs like The Weeds on Vox or The Ezra Klein Show, and I honestly didn't understand most of it at first, and to this day there are a lot of things that I don't understand. But when I listen, and I find myself able to track the conversation, I leave with some information that I fully grasp and a bunch of questions about things that I don't understand and avenues of study that I can pursue at my leisure. Because the way I view intelligence is it's a nurtured curiosity. And exposing and immersing yourself in things that you don't understand is a great way to maintain curiosity. And it might help for me to explain how I conceptualize like the pursuit of knowledge, which is pretty abstract a thing. But the way it feels to me is like knowledge is an abyss, like just I will never know everything. And so the more that I learn, the more I understand that I don't know. Put another way, the more that I know, the more that I understand that I don't know everything and that I'm not an expert. And that is an interesting feeling to have developed alongside the accumulation of knowledge, right? Like, I feel like I'm learning all this new stuff, and with it comes this nagging, omnipresent insistence that, like, I have not explored every crevice of this particular issue. I may feel passionate about my stance on healthcare policy, and I may have what I believe is a very robust understanding of healthcare policy and how it functions, but people know more than me, and I do not understand everything, and so there is information out there that would cause my opinion to change, that would completely reorient my understandings of an issue, and I just have to leave space for that. And square that with a desire to appear very resolute in my convictions, which I am. But there remains in me a tension of sorts, like between what I know and all that I do not understand, between like my worldview and a world which I do not yet understand and will never fully understand, because nobody can. And as a result, I maintain a sort of openness. I have my beliefs, I have my perspectives, ideological leanings, but there is so much information out there, some of which, as I encounter it, will change my mind. And I'm not embarrassed by that. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. If you believe the same thing for the whole of your life, honey, you're not growing. You're not learning. You're not changing. You're just stuck. And I say that because as I have learned more and understood more about politics, I've been able to articulate more eloquent defenses of my stances or articulate my beliefs in a more coherent way. And I look back on some of those wonderfully articulate statements that I just simply no longer agree with. And that doesn't mean that when I spoke, I was being intellectually dishonest. It just means I've grown, changed, and progressed. That I have learned something new that has caused me to reevaluate that which I have known. And that's a good thing. And learning something new does not mean that you were ignorant prior. It just means that you're a human being who is constantly learning and experiencing new things like every other human being, and you weren't born knowing everything. So, shame on you, I guess. But in all seriousness, there's something about learning that I think is interesting, in nurturing that kind of curiosity about whatever it is, politics or anything, because when you learn about something, you're going outside of yourself. You are separating from your like empirical daily experience and trying to ascertain and understand something else that is entirely abstract or otherwise not in your daily course of events. When I go to, a calculus class, for example, I have to stop being Skydoge, who's worried about whatever I'm worried about, and I have to gaze into the abyss of calculus and try to grab whatever nuggets of knowledge I can get. And I've never taken calculus, so I don't know anything about it. But the wonderful thing about education is that you have a sort of guide in the form of a teacher that helps you navigate the abyss of knowledge. And I want to be clear that when I say abyss, I don't mean like vacuum, I mean like endless amount, for what it's worth. And what a good teacher can do is point you in a specific direction in the abyss, like a kind of landing point where you can stop, survey your surroundings, develop an understanding, and then point to the next place that you progress to, where you learn something new and deepen your understanding. But the part of learning which requires stepping outside of the self, a sort of depersonalization and a separation of like myself and my feelings and current goings on in my life to understand, in the case of politics, what's going on in the world around me on a massive global scale. It was really helpful for me at the time because my day-to-day experience was not one that I was enjoying, and oddly enough, the hellscape of American politics became a way that I could get outside of my day-to-day suffering and understand the world around me. That one, my experience is one small fraction of this grander story, which is occurring on an incomprehensible scale. And that put my feelings in perspective, which isn't to say they invalidated the struggle I was going through. In some ways, it helped me avoid thinking about the struggles I was going through, and that wasn't particularly helpful. And so that's where I think a balance comes in. Like, as I talked about media diets earlier, you may have noticed it's composed exclusively of political media, and that's not balanced. You want to balance your political media, but you also want to balance the presence of political media in your media diet with other things so that you're not thinking constantly about politics and the world, and maybe you actually pay attention to the problems that you have. I'm mostly talking to past me, but he's not subscribed to this podcast. But for all the ways that being a political junkie, if you'll excuse the expression, enabled my avoidance of certain emotional minded issues by instead exclusively rigorously engaging my logical side of the brain via politics and policy. I also was able to, via politics, develop a connection to the world, this broader, huge, incomprehensible world that I felt like in some tiny way I could make a difference in, and more importantly, that I just fucking cared about. And it's not the subject of this podcast, so I don't intend to go into it in depth, but I'm a person who really values something that connects me to life and the world and kind of keeps me engaged. I really need that. And politics was that for me. It was something that felt real, and that if I invested time and energy and intellect and curiosity, that there would be like a actual difference. in the world, and that might be a worthwhile investment of time, even amidst a life that I was going through at the time, which was rather difficult. Please put away your world's smallest violins. I'm not here to ask for your pity, but I'm here to tell you how politics served me. And it served me as a distraction, a sort of numbing agent from some of the other emotional stuff that might have subsumed me. But it also became an anchor to the world in a more broad sense. And I needed that. TLDR, politics gave me hope, even as I observed a hopelessly dysfunctional system. I was high off the young idealism of liberal academia and a feeling that, like, hey, maybe we could change some stuff. And I still do feel that way. But sometimes I don't. I go into full tilt nihilism and I need to take a fucking break. I'm burnt out. You know what I mean? And that's the next thing we're going to discuss. But speaking of taking a break, let's take one of those now. This episode of The Liberal Bubble is brought to you by Partisan gerrymandering, the process by which state-level political operatives redraw district lines to benefit their political party. Partisan gerrymandering isn't new. In 1812, a Boston newspaper ran a political cartoon lampooning the newly redrawn South Essex County district in Massachusetts. The cartoon accentuated the ways in which the highly irregularly drawn district resembled a dragon-like creature. More reasonable people at the time, those who didn't believe that dragons were real, compared the district to a salamander. And since the district was drawn to give an advantage to incumbent Governor Elbridge Gerry's party, a portmanteau for the ages was born. Gerrymandering. And nobody has saw fit to forbid the practice since. Because, if you think about it, gerrymandering is simply inverted democracy, representatives choosing their voters instead of voters choosing their representatives. Democracy still resembles a democracy even when inverted and perverted, right? Just say yes. Partisan gerrymandering. Why the fuck is this still allowed to happen? Back to the show. And we are back. Here to talk about what it's like to burn the fuck out. And I'll do that by sharing my experience because I'm speaking into a void here today. Hello, void. And hopefully a few listeners. If you're listening to this podcast, go get a glass of water. Hydration is super important. But back on topic, I was in that political groove for years. And the thing that snapped me out of it, it was a two-step process. Twitter was a way that I would constantly, obsessively remain plugged into the goings-on. And in February of 2020, it was 2019. Time's a bitch, ain't it? Anyways, I decided I needed to take a break from Twitter because I was tired of having people seriously accuse Pete Buttigieg of being a Republican for not supporting Medicare for All as conceptualized by Bernie Sanders. Which, I mean, feel what you want to feel, but it's incorrect, just like factually. There's a lot of disagreement within the Democratic Party. I happen to be in favor of a single-payer system for reasons I can talk your ear off about another day, but Pete Buttigieg's stance on the issue does not render him a Republican, and I simply couldn't stand the discourse. Because I was spending like an hour and a half typing responses to nobody. So instead I spent an hour a week talking to Hopefully somebody. Hi. Say hi back. Thank you. But my falling out with politics really came to a fruition due to a little thing called the coronavirus. Perhaps you've heard of it. I was watching the news all through the beginning of 2020. I was observing videos of what Wuhan looked like during its lockdown due to this virus. And I was observing a federal government doing jack shit. And I'm old enough to remember like the panic of Ebola virus in like 2014 and some of the things that our government did and how none of those things were being done by the government we had at the time. And mostly I just yelled at my therapist about how this is going to become a much bigger problem. And when it did, I don't quite know how to explain it. I guess I felt consumed by grief and just, in a word, overwhelmed. Because the fear I had, and I think a lot of people expressed with a Trump presidency, is that one day something would come along which would actually really test his leadership abilities. And it became clear to me very quickly that this was that. And I remember the moment it became very serious to me, I was in Harvard Square, and I suddenly saw Harvard students evacuating the campus, and I was like, this is something else. This is something serious. And then I think the straw that broke the camel's back for me was the death counters on networks like CNN, which I do understand, but which felt very morbid and strange to me. And my feeling at the time was, I've been keeping up with this shit since Donald Trump was elected. I'm tagging out. And what I witnessed was most other people tagging in because this felt like a time to pay attention to the news. And, like, understandably so, it probably makes a ton of sense to tune into the news at the beginning of a global pandemic. But I was so cynical, I was just like, I'm going to consult the CDC guidelines and ignore everything that comes out of the White House. I don't need to know how many people have died. I just need to know what to do for myself to keep myself safe and to not contribute to the proliferation of this virus, and do my part as a citizen to maintain some semblance of public health. And the way I did that was by entering a state of denial and returning to my first love, a lady by the name of cinema. And in the month of March in 2020, I watched 75 films, which is a lot of films, and was a dramatic increase from all of the months prior, where all of my time had been consumed by keeping up with politics. At that time, it was the Democratic primary for the presidential nomination that had me enraptured, but I couldn't do it anymore. Things had gotten to a point where I no longer felt like paying attention to the news and knowing what's happening would make any difference on a global scale. Separate from CDC guidelines and all of that information, the death count doesn't help me operate day to day. And it, if anything, where politics used to make me feel some amount of hope and agency, I suddenly began to feel just overwhelming despair. And so, denial, baby, that's where we're going. That's destination denial. Vis-a-vis cinema. Showtimes around the clock, okay? Never ending. For months, many, many months, I'll tell you, during this time, I saw hundreds of movies. I watched the entirety of James Bond in 1 month. My brain broke. I watched through the entire MCU. My brain broke. I saw some other really good movies. And I don't hate the Marvel movies. Listen, I don't want our very active listener base attacking me in the comments for disparaging Marvel films. Though I agree with Marty, they're not cinema. Hot take. But even then, as I immersed myself in film, I wasn't completely detached from politics. I listened to an interesting discussion, oddly enough, on The Weeds from the Vox Media Podcast Network. I honestly should be paid to plug their shit at this point. But it was about cultural criticism and media criticism and its intersection with politics. It was revolving around the idea that film criticism used to be local. Your paper would hire somebody to go see the newest releases and write in the paper whether or not they thought it was worth you spending your money at the box office. And those jobs simply don't exist anymore for many reasons. Local papers are a dying or dead industry. And with the advent of aggregators like Rotten Tomatoes, you kind of get like a very broad view of critic responses from across the country and globe, to be fair. So in response to that, film criticism and film theory, which is what I also study, has, in the opinion of the speaker on this episode of the podcast I was listening to, criticism itself has become more political in nature. Art that we evaluate, we are more likely to tie to current events or politics, or we are more likely to attempt to suss out a political statement, in this person's opinion, partly in a defense of the profession itself. The idea that, like, hey, we still serve a function as film critics. Feel free to agree or disagree. But I thought there was some merit to that idea. And I've certainly observed and participated in that phenomenon, that leaning towards a more political approach to film generally. I say that as a person who just watched Godzilla vs. Kong and interpreted the film as a allegory for economic superpowers fighting for global dominance in a new century. And if you're wondering how the fuck I got that out of the movie where the monkey fights the lizard, it's there. Doesn't mean it means jack shit, but I could write a paper about it. Would it be a good paper? Probably not. It's based on Godzilla vs. Kong. But my point is, even an action blockbuster bonanza where a giant radioactive lizard fights a humongous gorilla, I, as a film student, as the credits rolled, did feel like each titan represented a capitalist titan. And I'm not going to get into that because it's a massive fucking waste of time and the subtext is so thin it's barely there. But that's what I do when I fall out. I watch film, and even then I'm still engaging with politics. It's just not necessarily current events. I also love books. Take a break. I mean, I've read like 25 books this year so far. Most of them are Stephen King, so it's not like I'm doing any heavy intellectual lifting. But the books themselves are quite heavy. I also can't read. I'm post-literate. I listen to audiobooks almost exclusively due to attention deficit problems. This episode is very personal. I don't like it. I miss Gleep.
Okay, let's move on.
So when it comes to books, I reach for the most horrible, nightmare-inducing hellscapes written by Stephen King or anyone else who can offer me similarly revolting, stomach-churning experiences, which I crave as comfort. But I will also say on the subject of books that they have helped enhance my understanding of politics and history very, very much. I would like to shout out one of my favorite books, These Truths by Jill Lepore. I almost said Amanda Lepore, who is an icon in a very different way. Jill Lepore wrote a fantastic single volume of the United States in all of its history with proper recognition of the oppression that happened alongside the founding and during the founding of this country and all the time which followed thereafter. And it was so helpful for me to build a background understanding of the country and some of its history. I don't remember everything, but I have a much more functional understanding. I also have a thing for presidential biographies. My theory being, presidents tend to be at the nexus of like most politically significant things, in that, every law has to come across their desk. Their election is usually a reflection of the moment in terms of cultural attitudes and such. They have immense power in terms of foreign policy. So, I think examining presidents is a pretty decent way to get an overview of a particular period in history, though it pays to be cognizant of who is the author of the biographies, because different authors feel differently about different presidents. I read a book about Ronald Reagan, which was the best I could find about him, and which was written by someone who has a lot of reverence for the man. And I respect that point of view, but I might go so far as to take the halo off old Gipper's head, give him a handful of jelly beans and send him on his way. But eventually, I have to come out of my little hidey hole. I don't have to, but I do feel obligated to. Because, like I mentioned before, news and politics helps me feel connected to something outside of myself and my life and my experience, which isn't always a party. And the thing that really brought me back to the table was the 2020 election, because it was honestly more nightmare-inducing than anything Stephen King has ever fucking written. And I am fascinated by electoral politics, and I was in existential terror of the outcome, so I needed to know. And I did, and that brought me back to the table. I started paying attention to the news. The way I began was by tuning into the PBS NewsHour. Surprise, surprise. If your way is tuning into cable news, listen, I'm not here to judge you. I'm not a judge. I'm just your good Judy, okay? So, no disrespect. But if you're, living off cable news, may I suggest incorporating something new, something spicy, or in the case of the PBS NewsHour, something soothing and bland. But either way, here I was back at the table. I had missed a whole bunch of shit, and yet there's no previously on the news. It's just you hit the ground running, and you pick up where you are, not where you left off. And that can feel itself like a really overwhelming undertaking. But if you've done the work to immerse yourself and engage in politics to whatever extent you're able and comfortable with your time and your schedule, not everyone is like me and has the passion and makes the time to watch 7-hour C-SPAN hearings. And that does not make you abnormal. I'm the nerd. I'm the weird one here. But in the same way that one goes about developing an initial understanding of politics, so too does one go about re-engaging with it. And I think you'll find that it's easier than starting from square one and just getting your feet wet, diving in. You will begin to see something cohere in your brain that is understandable. You'll be able to understand what's going on mighty quick. I've had some people close to me express a sort of lack of interest in the news now that Donald Trump is no longer president, not because they were fans of Donald Trump, but because they felt like they could not look away from the absolute train wreck. And I sympathize with that. I truly do. Because to some extent I feel the same way. I felt obligated to stay up to date on the most recent belligerent tweet at a foreign leader or human rights violation or half-baked policy being announced with no process. And now that Joe Biden is in the White House and things are some semblance of not what they were, let's just say that, it feels less urgent. It feels less necessary to engage in politics without that urgency of a giant dumpster fire consuming the entire screen. But the tone and tenor of the Biden administration, at least thus far, lends itself to a more wonky and policy-focused approach to the news. It is no longer governed by crisis, scandal after scandal, filling up every news cycle. You actually get to hear about things like a COVID relief plan or an infrastructure plan. And I think it's only natural to find those types of things less sexy than like all the crimes and stuff that we were used to seeing for 4 years on an almost daily basis. But this is the meat and potatoes of governance. It kind of, I guess it maybe is more like the news equivalent of eating your vegetables. But like, those are important in your diet, in a balanced diet. As a general rule, if I find a news source's analysis of a particular issue to be exclusively politically framed, I just note that. I don't think it's a inherent problem, but it means that you're receiving information from one viewpoint. The viewpoint of what is politically popular, who will get elected as a result of a particular action or occurrence or development. Other news sources will take more time to explore, how a particular development or new policy will actually impact people, rather than speculate about how those people will vote in an election that is 2 or 4 years away, or whatever the case may be. So that's a good indicator. If your news is primarily giving you information that feels like it's focused on the politics of the issue, something's probably being left out. And if you're watching a panel argue, change the channel. It's not fucking news. Listen, go watch Real Housewives. I swear to fucking God. I don't understand why cable news does the thing where it invites a token opposition person to be on their panel, and then everyone yells at them like, bitch, I'm not tuning into the news for the interpersonal drama. I don't care. Tell me what's happening in Syria. But cable news doesn't have time for that because they have to make money, and conflict sells. So here's Anna Navarro yelling at a conservative. News. We are seeing an attempt on the right side of the aisle to talk a lot about cultural issues instead of the policy being put forth by this administration and being drafted by Democratic caucuses in Congress. And news sources that are unbiased in the center and that are left of center have fallen into talking about these issues too. Hell, we did fucking 2 episodes on that shit. We did Dr. Seuss and Lil Nas. So, like, my hands ain't clean. I'm just a massive hypocrite. But all of that is distraction from the actual work and substance of policy, which is actually coming to the fore now that there's a process in the executive branch. And so as the administration proceeds, it may feel wonky, it may feel inaccessible, it may feel not sexy. So if you feel that way, I would perhaps recommend picking an issue, something about which you feel passionately, and using that as a means by which to re-engage with politics in the present. There's always something going on with every issue, usually in Congress, if not, coming from the bully pulpit of the White House. There is always something going on, even if most of it goes nowhere. And even if it goes nowhere, it can still provide a lot of information about what a policy might look like, and then you can evaluate whether or not you think that policy looked good. It gives insight into the process of governance in terms of passing laws, signing laws by the president, or the complete breakdown of that process, as is the case in American governance. But the fact of the matter is, there is so much work that you can do and ways to get involved in politics in whatever capacity you find yourself compelled to that are outside the system, that are, involve advocacy, organizing. If it's joining a club at your college, if it's volunteering to help a candidate get reelected, if it's calling your congressman, if it's, joining a chapter of like-minded individuals in your area and advocating for change, protesting. All of these things are ways to be involved in politics, even if it doesn't have to do with the concept of people in suits in Congress writing bills and all of that. There's no one way to politically engage with the world around you. And so, don't be afraid to do so in whatever capacity you feel comfortable. Of course, provided that it is peaceful. That is a essential imperative to political advocacy, if you ask me. But I often have people express to me this sort of guilt about not having kept up with the news, this sense that they ought to be and they haven't been, and I don't know if people expect me to shame them. I don't think that I do. I mean, I'm the bitch that stuck my fingers in my ears and went, la 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 la, I can't hear you, when COVID happened and everything felt completely unmanageable and out of control. So we're all coping, we're working, we're trying to get by. And do I personally think it's important to stay up to date? Yeah, to whatever extent you can. And that extent is entirely variable. And I don't think it helps to beat yourself up or bring any sense of self-judgment to the level of engagement that you can manage, as long as you're engaging. And there are ways to engage that aren't as, in-depth as what I've described. You don't have to sit down for a whole hour to listen to the news. There are podcasts every morning that are about 10 minutes with just quick updates about breaking news, developing stories. NPR has one called Up First, if you want one that is relatively even in its presentation and tone, much like the PBS NewsHour. Or if you want something a little more overtly partisan, liberal, and sassy, Crooked Media has one called What a Day. There's no shortage of them. They're a great free and accessible resource. As always, when you're navigating a media environment, I think it's incredibly important to be aware of who's producing the content, what ideological leanings they may have, what agendas they may have. It's why my program's called The Liberal Bubble. I'm pretty fucking clear that I'm a staunch libertarian. Just kidding. No, I'm a liberal. And you know that. I don't have to tell you twice. But when it comes to re-engaging with politics, the fact of the matter is there isn't really like a wrong way to do it. There are probably ways that are better than others. I don't think I'm really qualified to specify which is which and where goes what, But, as I mentioned before, I'm rather emphatic that violence not be a part of your political advocacy. I'm rather comfortable saying I think that's the wrong way to engage politically. But ultimately, do not be daunted, dear listener. I may not know you personally, but I know you're smart as fuck because you're listening to this podcast, and so you clearly have excellent taste. And so I hope you'll take my advice and dive headfirst into the abyss of information and learning. In whatever form that looks like for you, I hope I've provided some resources and tools which might make that process a little bit less like it's jumping into an abyss. Like maybe you have a place to land and survey your surroundings and chart a path. And if I haven't, I suppose I failed this episode. But my point is that it is normal to not think about politics all the time, every day. And sometimes I feel like the ethos of this show might indicate otherwise. But I'm a Doge person just like you. I get exhausted. I get overwhelmed. And I'm not going to lie to you and say that I know what's going on all the time. Because I don't think I've watched the news anywhere near as frequently as I normally would and would like to, but I don't want to, at least for right now. And the world will keep turning, and I will re-engage with it when I'm ready, relatively soon. And it'll be okay. I don't have to self-flagellate for doing so. Nor do you, dear listener. So if you're plugged in and getting every news alert from every paper on your phone, keep it up and don't let it consume the entirety of your being. And if you're taking some distance from the news, don't forget about Judy Woodruff. She misses you. So re-engage. You'll be happy that you did. That's it for this week's episode of The Liberal Bubble. My name is Skydoge, and I'm here entirely alone. You can find me at Skydoge Bubble on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also contact me via email at Skydoge. That's not how emails work. My email is skydogebubble@gmail.com. Things are great. Everything's great. Lady Gleep will be back in the tub with us next week. So if you found this a little bit awkward, you're not alone. But I think we're closer for it, And I'm glad. Goodbye.